Right, we're going to move on to our next speaker now, and that's Ella Al-Samari. She is a political monitoring consultant and was formerly a vice president at FOSIS. Assalamu alaikum and good evening to everybody here. Firstly, before I start, I'd really like to thank this one. Okay. So before I start, I'd like to thank MAB for organising this event. I think I was really heartened actually to see that we were talking about this topic. As a young person myself, I feel it's critical to my future. I feel it's going to be fundamental to the way we live our lives moving forward. So I think it's incredibly important as a Muslim communities rather, that we talk about this seriously and consider the impacts of it moving forward. So today I'm not here speaking as an expert, much like my esteemed other panelists. I'm here to give the youth perspective as to the impact of what Brexit might be on us. Speaking as someone who has worked for a Muslim organisation, I also represent young Muslims on different groups, and so I think, but today I'm not necessarily speaking as a Muslim, I'm speaking as just a young person, but also Muslims are also people in this country, so we are equally affected by everything that takes place. I think what really came through the Brexit vote referendum, the campaign, what was really stark following that when we saw the results of how people voted was just in fact how many young people voted to remain. And it's been one of these sticking points following the referendum, which has really ignited a lot of frustration and anger amongst young people against their older generations, their grandparents, etc. I mean, it's fair to say that young people will be the most affected people of this decision. We are the ones who have to live for the majority of our lives with the consequences of what happens, whether good or bad. And therefore, it's really important that that's recognised and that people acknowledge the voice of young people in this discussion. So just to give you some stats, so most young people voted to stay in the EU according to the last YouGov poll before the referendum, so this was the exit poll, or the closest thing to an exit poll. 72% of 18 to 24-year-olds were in favour of a Remain vote, while only 19 backed Brexit. In fact, contrast that with pensioners, only 34 of pensioners were in favour of Remain, while 59% favoured Brexit. So these often repeated results, it's been a source of lots of the blogosphere articles, lots of things have come out of the back of it, just really relaying the deep frustration and anger for many young people. Many of whom feel betrayed almost by those older than them, those who will be referred to as the baby boomers, those that being those who were born following the years following the Second World War, and who benefited from a lot of the things that the European Union gave us, whether it was job security, high economy, a strong economy rather, affordable housing, many things that seem like a far distant dream right now for many young people, myself included. So that's, so like I say, better jobs, free education, affordable housing. And now many of us are faced with an uncertain future. It's right to note that actually we do need to be careful about how negative we come across when we talk about this. It's still very much in process. Brexit, we are still very much part of the European Union. Article 50 has not been triggered yet. We don't know how long the whole thing is going to take, nor do we know what the end result is going to be. So we take this with a pinch of salt. Obviously, it's not ideal, but we need to make the best of what we do have. But now, for young people, we will be denied privileges such as the freedom of movement. So that means for work, for studying, and just traveling and new experiences. Not forgetting all the other risks that might be involved, especially with regards to the economy. We saw that the pound dropped as soon as the result was announced. Things such as our quality of life, and often forgotten things such as the environment, which is a quite close thing to me because that's a sector I work within. So that's something that we don't yet know the outcome of. And in fact, the Institute for Fiscal Studies found that young people were earning less and had higher living costs than their predecessors, and predicted that Brexit would only make things worse, unfortunately. And so I think what I found really interesting following this is that it highlighted a significant intergenerational divide. And we've seen this for a while. We were constantly told, we need to be engaging more with young people, you need to be increasing them, get the vote out. And yet we heard quite constantly young people being blamed for the fact that that we, basically not enough of you came out and voted. Basically, it's your fault, don't complain. But then that sort of removes the responsibility of accepting that actually there's a responsibility on civic society, the government, to actually engage with this issue. I mean, it is true that had more young people voted, we would likely still be in the European Union. But that doesn't mean that we can't accept that argument. We need to address the cause of the problem. Actually, I've already picked up on this, that there are reasons why people voted the way they did. And I found interesting in this a quote from a young activist for the organisation Bite the Ballot, who works on registering young people to vote. And this person said, "If no one inspires you, that is how you end up being marginalised, divided and fearing." And I thought that really summed up the campaign, to be honest. Both referendum campaigns failed to inspire people. They failed to engage with young voters. And quite frankly, we do focus a lot on the Vote campaign and how negative it was, but the Remain campaign wasn't that much more positive. And in fact, it gave in to this discourse around immigration and so on. And then now what we're seeing is this increasing disillusionment. It's been a growing thing, and it's almost like a phenomenon we're facing, where many young people are being turned away. They're very active, they're passionate people, but young people are engaged. They're just not voting, they're just not showing up and engaging in the political. And it's now pushing people towards populist politics, which sort of explains this whole the movement around Jeremy Corbyn, but we won't go into that. But I mean, he's definitely attracting a lot of young people, and a lot of that is to do because he's seen as anti-establishment, so people are drawn to that. But that's one of the main points I wanted to give today, was just more about just understanding the anger and frustration many young people feel off the back of this result. Moving forward, another sector which is incredibly important for young people is obviously academia. The impact of this on young people. Currently, I have, as a student, I had the benefit of if I wanted to we're studying in a European country, with the same costs as if I was studying in the UK. In addition to that, we have what we call the Erasmus program, which allows for students to study for a semester abroad. This, is significant in terms of increasing life experience of young people and the job prospects, especially in a market which is becoming increasingly more difficult, more demanding on skills. It really made people stand out a bit from the crowd. All of this is now open for debate. We don't know whether this is even a possibility anymore. And it does concern me that a lot of young people are obviously quite disheartened by this. Not forgetting those who are in academia in terms of research. There are potential problems, or it jeopardizes like research funding. Again, that's something that universities did warn about. The majority of actually who were in favour of Remain as well. And just generally, just the beautiful diversity we have on British campuses. We're here at Sawa, so I've just walked in on the campus and you can see graduation, and it's amazing the diversity on this campus, all these happy families from all corners of the earth. And it saddens me that might not be the case moving forwards in the future. So that's obviously one thing we need to consider. And finally, the final point I'd like to make, which is something Shanaz already picked up on, but it's the issues around, not just Shanaz, but Khalil as well, in terms of the worrying message that Brexit sends to young people and young Muslims as well, in fact. We saw it's a very hate-filled campaign, lots of fear-mongering, centred primarily around immigration. And so it was really no surprise that we saw this sharp rise in xenophobia and racist incidents. And in fact, many of the people affected have been young Muslims, simply because we are visibly different, and people see us as the other. And that as a result of that, we're the ones, even though we're not, I came to this country when I was 4 or 5 years old. I'm not from Europe. It doesn't apply to me, this particular notion, but that doesn't matter to those who voted leave. If you're a racist, as was rightly quoted, that's just how they see it. Immigration equals just anybody not white, essentially. And for many young Muslims who already face a number of multiple identities, who are conflicted by issues around integration and who do our loyalties lie to and all this other stuff, this is something that we as a Muslim community need to be really aware of. We need to nurture, we need to ensure we are raising the issue regularly and making sure that people are addressing it properly as well. So looking ahead, I did say I don't want to be awfully negative about everything. It is obviously, Brexit is humongously significant. We do also need to consider that off the back of Brexit, we saw a new Prime Minister, a new government come into place. And that has different implications, but that's a conversation for another day perhaps. And whilst obviously there are negatives, that the next few years will be challenging, we need to remember that we as Muslims are not, we are a people of action. That's what the Prophet ﷺ taught us to be, and we need to follow in his example. We can't let this bring us down. And speaking for the youth in particular, I think there definitely is anger and frustration, and we need to figure out how best to harness that towards political engagement, getting involved. I mean, I'm so pleased to see so many young people in the crowd today, because this is such a critical issue for young people. And that means, supporting organisations such as the NUS or FOSIS, those who have already said they want to make sure that young people are at the table making decisions along with decision makers. And yes, I've been called for time, so I'll leave it there. But thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Anas Al-Takriti, the CEO of the Cordoba Foundation and the chairman of MAP.
Yes.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. What's this with only men getting one of these?
Well, I don't want to feel like a lady.
That really needs to be addressed as well. Equality without any compromise. Top to bottom. That's the way.
Islam and inequality. That would be the title. Then discussing the way that they are treated similarly.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Everyone, assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for coming today. And, my thanks and congratulations to the Muslim Association of Britain and everyone who's been part of setting up this this event. I think that what's been presented already has been extremely comprehensive, quite rich, very, very beneficial. I'll try my best not to tread on anyone's toes. It's one of the problems and perils of speaking last, because a lot of what you intended to say has already been said, and probably, in fact, definitely much, much better. So I'll try to approach this from a different angle. The first thing I would like to say is that I only wish that this particular debate or discussion would have happened on a wider level before the EU referendum, because I did a mini survey of the people that are within my own circles, either locally in northwest London or across the country, family and relatives. And it turns out that more than 70% of the people within my circle actually voted for leave. And particularly those who lived in areas which didn't actually vote for leave, such as London. So, and most people received messages from various Muslim organizations and Muslim figures, very respectable figures, telling them before the EU referendum, telling them that this, by the way, don't ever be fooled by the fact that this might be something which could be portrayed as an issue that represents or concerns Muslims. It doesn't, it's not important, it's not. And it turns out that whilst I, for instance, when I got the message, I didn't think that it would matter much. But in actual fact, a lot of people did respond to that message and were also either drawn back from full enthusiastically, taking part in the referendum, or actually caring as to, what the outcome was. So, just maybe a note for next time round when we have something quite momentous and important. Let's have these debates before, as well as after, but definitely before. I was also reminded when I saw Brother Khalil's opening slide by the very famous historical notes, and I was reminded by a saying by an elderly Scotsman who was once told about how the British run an empire upon which the sun never set, and his response was, because God never trusts the English in the dark. It's interesting, but I think it's this particular issue is important from a number of angles. And whilst the presumption is that when we're asking about what next for British Muslims, or for Muslims, is that we are assuming that we are talking about British Muslims. And I think that from Shahnaz as well as Khalil, and I think they've touched quite eloquently upon the potential possible hazards or different scenarios, let's say, trying to mix the positive and negative as to how we will be impacted. But actually, I think it's important that we look at this from a global perspective, because it's not just us who are impacted by this, although we are going to be impacted by this directly, but it's also the European Muslims, for instance, from whom we are going to be separated as citizens, as European citizens. They're going to be also impacted, so we need to look at how they are going to be impacted, particularly when we're talking about institutional and organizational structures. And also, a very interesting point, which was funnily enough raised to me by a conservative journalist who asked me about how I thought that Brexit, the UK leaving the EU, would actually impact the Muslim world, or the main central, let's say, the main focal Muslim issues, such as Palestine, such as what's happening in Syria, or in Iraq, or in Egypt, or in Kashmir, or the like. Will it have any kind of impact? And if so, what kind of impact is that likely to be? So I think that it's important that when we do look at this, we try to see it from a 360-degree sort of perspective. But there is something that is quite undeniable, and that is that today we are discussing this issue at a time of heightened political theatre. Those of us who are, ever intrigued by, the plays of Shakespeare and the such, I mean, nothing comes close to the kind of drama that we see unfolding before our very eyes every few weeks here in the UK. It's almost unbelievable. Every single one of the events that are happening deserve their own chapter, in the history book of the 21st century. But they're all happening one after the other, whether it be, from the mayoral elections and how the narrative dominated those elections, and how a few weeks after that we had the EU referendum, and then immediately, within a matter of hours of the results coming out, we had the Prime Minister stand down. He had barely been a year into his term as the first elected Conservative leader since 1992, and yet, he didn't outsee his own term. And then, all of a sudden, and probably the most telling drama of all, is the fact that the leading figures of the Brexit campaign all just fell by the wayside, either voluntarily or, by some sort of hook, one by one, very, very rapidly. Whether it be from Nigel Farage, whose baby this was. I mean, let's not forget, say what you may about Nigel Farage, but listen, when UKIP first emerged something like 15, 20 years ago, and they used to win something like a few dozen votes here or there, and they were a laughingstock. No one thought that we would come to a time when essentially their product, their only product, would come to fruition. And if anything, for those of you who want to study history or politics or the such, in terms of political determination or the vigor, for a dream that is so distant right now and seems so impossible, implausible even, to be honest, it's a lesson worth reading about. The Boris Johnson standing aside, to Michael Gove being, kicked out of the leadership in quite unsavory terms. And ultimately, we end up with a Prime Minister who is on the Leave side. It's to say that it's farcical would be putting it mildly. It's quite dramatic. It's very, very interesting. It's very intriguing. I would suggest that I don't even think that triggering Article 50 is a foregone conclusion. I would be extremely interested to see who is brave enough to see to it that the next. Well, this particular government is absolutely exhausted in talks that would expand to probably 3 or 4 years in trying to disentangle Britain from its European partner over the past 40, 42 years. I would, you know, and to be honest, I think that the likelier, if I was to weigh options, I would say that we're likelier to see a snap election sometime next spring. Around March or April time, maybe we'll have a snap election, simply because the issue of triggering Article 50 is way, way bigger and arduous and difficult and burdensome than anyone would have expected or projected. I think that this offers us opportunities, as well as obviously challenges that it comes with. I think that it offers us the challenge of thinking according to new paradigms and new dimensions. This is a chance to build pan-European institutions away from the political kind of homogeneity of Europe as it was up until last month. I think that if I was a Muslim citizen in Syria today, or in Egypt, or in Iraq, I wouldn't be too disheartened about what's happened regarding the EU as a bloc that has proven a worth from an economic level, but far less of a worth on a political level. I would see this in positive terms rather than negative, and I think that that's important. All of this is happening whilst another chapter of this whole theatre is unfolding across the Atlantic in America, and I think that what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 months, leading to the outcome of who becomes the next president of the United States, I think that that will have a big, big say on the outcome of this particular chapter, and whether Britain leaves Europe, how it will leave Europe, and what kind of impact it will have, not only on Muslims, but on societies as a whole. I would like to expand on the suggestion and proposal of Brother Khalid and several of the speakers, that we focus our efforts or a call to Muslims and as such. I think we could do better than that. I totally agree, but I think we could do better than that. I think that this offers us a unique opportunity to actually become a voice for society. A voice for society. Ultimately speaking, our religion calls وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. And I think that there is no other group that is guided, no other sector of community that is guided by such an incredible statement, a divine statement, that we have indeed honored and dignified human beings on every single level, on every single level. Think about it. Not just socially and the human rights and freedoms, but even politically, economically, you know, job-wise and the such, you know, on every single level. And I think that it's about time that we develop that kind of narrative. There will be, of course, a hike in Islamophobia. There will be, you know, a hike and rise in the percentage of attacks, verbal and otherwise, on Muslims, and particularly Muslim women who are visibly Muslims, and they are the first line of defense, if I may use that term, of the Muslim community. Of course we'll see that. That's part of the price we pay as peoples, because we are in a flux as human beings, as human societies. This is symptomatic. This is symptomatic of the way the world is. It's not just the Muslim world that is breaking up. It can also happen in the West as well. Assalamu alaikum.